Thomas Pynchon's Mason and Dixon. Hello everyone. I finished reading this great novel last weekend, and I went through it pretty fast. I couldn't put it down. This is the fastest read of a Pynchon book I have ever experienced. And I'm just going to take off where I left off with parts 2 and 3, America, and part 3, Last Transit in here, just going off my notes and kind of riffing off that, and we'll see where it goes. Well, I think I mentioned on page 278, George Washington, who knew he was a weed smoker. If anyone's familiar with Thomas Pynchon's novels, there's always some drug use and a lot of marijuana smoking in it. And in this one, Mason and Dixon get high with George Washington. Martha Washington makes an appearance. She doesn't partake, however. A lot of drinking in pubs in this novel as well. 285, there's electricity experiments. Ben Franklin makes his first appearance. I also want to mention I learned a lot about post-colonial days, and it really sparked my interest so much. In fact, I'm going to read David McCullough's 1776, and I'm also going through one of the great courses on post-colonialism right now. Anyway, getting back to the novel, a lot of Masonic information in here, in that, in fact, Mason, by virtue of his last name, is automatically gilded into the Masonic Lodge in here. And there's all the secret handshakes and the secret slogans, and how you know a Mason from a non-member. I think one of the phrases is, where comes ya? Right, where comes ya? And they meet up on page 299 with Dolly and Molly, two friendly girls, Mason and Dixon do. Now, Mason is referred to as gothically depressive, as Dixon is westernly manic. They're two opposites that get along. They get along ultimately. They have their ups and downs, and it's very humorous. They're different personalities, both astronomers, both dreamers in both senses of that word. They literally have dreams, nighttime dreams, and also, dreams of the future. Page 307, the Indians are starting to make an appearance in the novel, and there's descriptions of how the army purposely gave them smallpox. There's some horrific scenes, like I mentioned in the first part about the slaves. There'll be a link in the description box below to my first part of this review, as well as some other links. But it's pretty horrific, the scenes. The Indians are real magical. A lot of, in Pynchon's novels, he uses magic, Kabbalah, tarot. In this one, he's using a lot of astronomy. There's also many vignettes in here that, although I'd classify it as historical fiction, and it's accurate in some parts, other parts are obviously not. For example, chapter 37 is the first appearance of this mechanical duck. Now, in the 1700s, there was a rage about mechanical devices, and even human-looking robots who would play instruments in that, and there's parts of it in here. But there's a mechanical duck that this Frenchman discovers, and the duck falls in love with him. First, the duck is after him because he wants to avenge himself for have revenge on all the ducks this Frenchman has killed and eaten. The Frenchman escapes to America. He's so haunted by this duck. The duck follows him, and the duck is able to stop in mid-flight and all this fantastical things. But that might be one of my favorite vignettes in here. The other is a part, it's way over, let me find it, in chapter 63, page 619, this character, Zepho Beck, is a werewolf beaver. He's a hairy individual, so he has like the pelt of a beaver, but he also has a taste for eating trees. And it's kind of a tortoise and the hare vignette where this axeman who's able to chop down many trees is laughing because old Zephyr thinks he can beat him by eating the trees like a beaver. And Zephyr's wife stands by him and tries to understand him, and even says at one part, well, he puts up with my changes, and things like that. A lot of religious imagery in here, with the Christians and the Jesuits, Catholics, Eucharists, blood, flesh and blood, the eating of the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, juxtaposed with human flesh for sale, the Indians, and cannibalism on their part. Chapter 42, a lot of information, Pynchon scientific, but it has a way of making even a non-mathematical or scientific person like myself understand it. A lot of information about gravity and magnetism in here, angles, things like that. There's a part where they're describing it, they're trying to invent, to put magnetism in the earth so the plants will grow and they'll be able to be harvested by just a machine going over with a magnet and plucking the vegetables out of the earth. Now, Mason is a very jealous character, and he didn't at first receive the Royal Society honor for being an astrologer. And also notice Mason always comes first in Mason and Dixon, although Dixon is first in the order of alphabetical. Moving on, I have a lot of notes. I'm going to cut and paste probably here on page 479, a lot of wordplay. There's a part where they're arguing, and Mason corrects Dixon on his use of the word sorry, S-A-R-I, and Dixon understands it and says, "'Twas I who was Sarong," S-A-R-O-N-G, Sarong. A lot of pubs and inns along the line. There's descriptions of how they first come over to America, and they're starting on this line from Philadelphia. They're trying to get past Ohio on that, and all these hundreds of axemen just tearing down trees and plowing through, and the Indians think it's a machine of the gods coming. Just like imagine this, contraption eating up the trees and moving along, and just this swath of the line going between it. And while in the meantime they're actually making roads and all that, but there's all kinds of mystic Christians living in tree trunks, things like that, Kabbalistic golems, Irish wood nymphs, leprechauns as well. There's parts where in rivers that they dare not cross for fear of the Indians. Indians will make a major influence in the second part of the book. The novel takes place before 1776, before the independence and everything. That should be kept in mind. Page 562, Dixon goes off to New York and Broadway, it wasn't Broadway yet, and sees some theatrical performances and gets involved. He's quite a ladies' man, this Jerry Dixon. They're both dreamers, like I said, but Mason is, he gets into these dream states, especially with his late wife Rebecca. At some points you don't know if it's a dream or if it's actually reality to him. Chinese make a major appearance in the novel, especially this Captain Zhang, Z-H-A-N-G. He's just outrageously crazy. Everyone thinks he's crazy as well, and while he's crazy like a fox is what he is. And There's another vignette about this High and Whole characters who flee China. The dogs are howling, the chickens go to sleep during an eclipse in China. The pigs acquire the power of speech, saying, hush, hush. And they have to flee on a Chinese kite, and yeah, that's just like one chapter. It's just a great novel. I really enjoyed reading this. Whereas Against the Day took me several months to read, this only took me a few weeks. See, chapter 68, the Indians are quite the dreamers themselves. And scenes where the Americans they give them the rifles and they give them the guns and they trade for things with the Indians, and how can now the Americans complain that the Indians are using the guns to defend themselves. More Masonic information. Mason and Dixon don't understand how the Americans can have part in slavery. And chapter 72, there's more information about that. There's a lot of funny. Dixon prefers to wear a red coat like the English do. Details of the line, how they cut the trees, the axemen, the markings, how they prepare the path for later roads. There's, I mean, it's hundreds of people are part of this line. Traveling musicians, you know, cooks, the cook tent, chow hall, all that. Mason and Dixon get chased out of town at one point. They live on roots and fungus. They're trying to follow the Ohio line. They never quite get across it, but they come across Mexican and Spanish people dancing in the streets, more Chinese, Ukrainian, or Russian, very happy Russian people. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but in the novel, Mason and Dixon discover the planet Uranus, and they're finally given the just rewards there are due in London society over this. But at the time, few care about the discovery of a new planet. But they have fantasies of becoming rich and living high off the king in England, and they do go back to retire there, but it's not very long, and they separate for a span of a year or two, but they do come back together and make their third and final trip across America. There's another vignette where they have a fantasy of making a road across the Atlantic with, you know, 1,000 leagues across the sea, with shops of all sorts, inns, pubs, beacons, light beacons leading the way. Mason finally retires on St. Brendan's Isle, which is a nice town full of taverns, music halls, and gaming rooms. Dixon is quite the gambler as well. Now, Part 3, Last Transit, is very short. It starts off 15 December 1768 in London. Dixon wished to stay. Mason did not. And like I said, it's their third time they do go back to America. Still dreaming. Mason's still dreaming. It gets very sad at the end because we've had all this big chunk of a novel with their ins and outs and quarrels and breakups and makeups. And they had a family. Mason did remarry. Dixon had children as well. We have Dr. Johnson and Boswell making an appearance, and there's a correlation between Boswell and how he was Johnson's scribe with the Reverend Cherrycoke. It's told from his story. This whole novel is his reminiscence. He's telling his he's living with his sister, and there are people, he's trying to earn his keep as a storyteller. So it's all his embellishments, really, that we get the story from. But it's quite sad. Mr. Death visits Mason. Mason is quite melancholy, and he's a depressive type. So Mr. Death is visiting him now. He has dreamed of Mount Rushmore, the they're not quite statues, and there's no names under them, and it's all vague, but it's Mount Rushmore. Now, the Norfolk Terrier, the talking dog that begins this novel, makes an appearance 15 years later. In fact, we're not quite sure if it's the same old dog or if it's his one of his pups. The invention of chicken soup. Mason longs to return to America. He finally does. He wants to look up Washington, Franklin, all the old lads. He knows where all the coal is. He knows where all the iron is, and he can find where the gold is. Chapter 78, 7 years before, Mason tells a tale of Dixon dies 7 years before Mason did, but tells the tale of his son, the tales of working with Ben Franklin and electricity. Lots of vignettes on that, really humorous ones. Dixon's hair standing on end when Ben Franklin is doing an experiment and they're holding hands like that. And finally, there's, I mentioned there's Kabbalah and astrology in here, and there's a lot. There's this Astral Gematria. Gematria is just taking the letters from words. It's still around. They do it in the Old Testament and the New Testament probably, but taking letters from words and making other words from it. And this Astral Gematria is spelling out codes in the sky that can be read worldwide, and one of them says, "You are idiots," at one point. And anyway, just a great book. I can't recommend it enough. If it's your first time venturing into Pynchon, I recommend it because it's a through storyline of these two guys, and it's all connected in that regard. Still, there's hundreds of characters in it and all these adventures that go on, but it's great. Now, my next Pynchon read is going to be Bleeding Edge, and I'm going to be buddy reading it with our own Lillian Nieswender. Let me make sure. With our very own Lillian Nieswender. I'm sorry, Lillian, if I mispronounce your name. But Bleeding Edge is has a strong female character in it, and it starts off with in 2001 with the Twin Towers and 9/11, and it promises to be a great book. Not only that, it was a book chemist's favorite Pynchon novel. So with that recommendation, how can we go wrong? So shout out to Lillian, the constant reader, constant commenter, and thank you for your time and your consideration, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. Bye.